Thank you for being here this morning with your team. I'm going to follow up on the questions around the hotel isolation program. Did you look at the total costs, not just what it cost to pay the Canadian Red Cross, but the whole hotel isolation program?
We did ask the department about that. However, those costs were not separately tracked, so we were unable to identify the specifics for just that program.
So the department wasn't able to provide any information about that. Did you dig a bit deeper? I'm surprised that there wouldn't be a way to figure that out.
Again, you may be able to ask the department for more specifics. We did not receive details from the department on the specifics for that. Not uncommon, I would think, in the pandemic situation, and staff were being borrowed and loaned to help where available. It's possible one day a person could have been at the border control point, maybe the next day they're at the hotel covering something. There is a bit of a fluid movement of expertise and people that are working on many different things and were shared during the pandemic. So I can't, yes, it would be wonderful to know, but I'm not sure we would have even they would have the specifics. And in this case, we were auditing the evaluation of the programs and not so much the financial in this case for recommendations for future pandemics.
Okay, I guess I would assume that the financials would be part of the evaluation to see whether it was an effective use of resources to get certain results. And just to clarify, so it sounds like you didn't look at the Canadian Red Cross contract, because it says that it was hard to track down the information because the record keeping of the hotels was not adequate, but I wonder if the Canadian Red Cross should not have had adequate record keeping as part of the contract that they were fulfilling.
And so that is why we did ask the department to evaluate the program and those matters. It's because we're evaluating the pandemic response, and in this case, it's a reasonable question, but we've put that to the department to dig in and find those matters and find the information they require to do an appropriate evaluation for whether this is a useful tool for future pandemics or should not be done again.
Okay. I'm wondering whether you looked at the cost of the programs at the border and the effectiveness. I mean, one specific question would be, do you have data on what the actual wait times were? Because there were wait time targets here on page 62, 5.24. Did you get the actual wait time data to see whether the targets were met in any cases? And how much it cost?
there's no question if you just watch the news, everyone knows there were long wait times at the borders, and the department was not tracking that data in terms, or that we observed in the data we obtained from them to look at. Did not see anything that was tracking the wait times of people at the border, and it was, in a large part, it was yeah, and in paragraph 5.24 in our comments, we say, you know, despite these efforts that they had in place, backlogs did occur. Established targets, as noted, were not always met or measured against. And so, in that regard, yes, there's improvements they need to make. However, if you think about this in the delivery to New Brunswickers to implement the mandatory order and the safety at the borders and to do the inspections, they were following the orders that they were mandated to do. Is there room for improvement? Definitely.
Okay. As someone who lives about 10 minutes from the Allac border, I can tell you there were numerous problems with the policies, with the implementation, and I'm concerned that I'm not really seeing some of these things showing up in the report. I had higher hopes for what might be uncovered and what might be discussed. I don't see anything about how the business community was impacted by the implementation of the mandatory orders. There were many issues with that. How traveling workers were treated. There are so many people in my riding who cross the border every day, and how they were treated and how the different decisions made and how they, by public health, by health, but how they were implemented at the border, how there were unmarked cars chasing people down on the highway, and it was under public safety's supervision that this happened. And it was not that long after the shooting in Nova Scotia, where an RCMP car had been, or what looked like an RCMP car had been used. Compassionate exemptions were being implemented through public safety, even if decisions were coming from health. And there were people left without caretakers as a result of decisions being made, and I was dealing with public safety. So, can you talk about why those things aren't in here?
No, thank you for your comments. I think it's important to understand that, you know, when we are performing audits of departments, we're auditing against the directives and the policies that are given to the departments to implement. So when they get a policy, it's about applying it and the consistency for letting someone in or the refusal to let someone across the border. Audit standards prescribe the level of evidence that we require. I don't contest any of the things you're saying, but then I need evidence to be able to support these matters and bring it forward for recommendations and to support our audit findings. And what you see here today is what we can find for evidence to support the matters and the implementation against policy, against the government mandatory orders. And, you know, we've discussed the themes of our work in the the early challenges with record keeping. The department went from its early days of paper-based records, quickly established processes. Sometimes in cases, it made improvements as they could throughout this process. Certainly not perfect, and certainly the first time we've ever incurred such a thing. But without adequate evidence, as professional auditors, we're limited in what we can report about some of these matters. And it is about auditing to policy, auditing the key matters, and providing those recommendations for the future improvements. So certainly there's probably much more that can be done in the next pandemic to address concerns like what you and your constituents have. And I'm sure that you in your role are providing that feedback to the department, and I hope they listen and they use it with respect to our process. I think that was good, that what you're providing is good information for them to help utilize in their after-action review.
And I guess what I'm concerned about is that it's not in here, and I was hoping that this would be able to be used as a deeper dive into what needs to happen for preparedness. And so if those things are missing, I'm really concerned. And I can tell you, I have evidence for all of those things, and I have sent it to government officials and to different people. Sometimes I got responses. Sometimes we were able to fix things, but there are so many issues, and I'm thinking about the people who are not being captured here, people who had disabilities and seniors who needed caretakers, and their caretakers were no longer able to cross the border, and public safety was implementing that policy. And in here, you did say they didn't have evidence around how they were making decisions, and I'm extremely concerned about that. I'd be curious to know more about that. I'm extremely concerned that the Department of Health couldn't provide any evidence for any of the decisions that you sampled. I don't know 33 what percentage that is of how many decisions made, but that they couldn't provide any information. Can you tell us what the 33 things you looked at were?
Just one moment. Normally we don't get into all the details of our working paper files, but generally, we were looking at key decisions that focused on province-wide impacts, whether you're closing borders, whether you're masking decisions, shutdowns. We tried to look at things that affected the province as a whole, generally, in looking for the specific evidence that supported the decisions made. And yes, again, good questions to pose to the departments to hold them accountable. And
so on these very important decisions, including border closings or requirements to cross borders, including compassionate care exemptions, including masking or the removal of masking in schools, abandoning the vaccination rate goals and reopening borders at certain times, none of that had evidence provided. I simply don't understand. They said we cannot provide a fulsome and detailed list. Did you request even, well, I'll take a partial list? Was there anything that the government could provide to back up any of these recommendations?
the department indicated that they advised that they did consult with experts and that they did their research, but again, the evidence was not retained.
Time's expired. Thank you.
Ms. Mitton, Mr. Lagasse. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mr. Martin, and you and your team. And Mr. Martin, I have an internal struggle with either deep diving into any of these subjects or just scattering through about 14 different things I want to ask, but time management is a pain. But and I apologize for maybe being scattered, because I'm just going to scratch the itch that bugs me the most, and we'll just go through the afternoon that way. I guess I would start with a continuation on NB Power. I'm sure it doesn't surprise anybody in here that I was probably going to go there first. And I like and I find interesting the answer that you gave my colleague about challenging us to keep them accountable. But one of the frustrations that I have is, to keep them accountable, we need proper measurements. We need a proper benchmark to look at. So I just want to go around the debt. I'm not going to argue that anybody in New Brunswick is not worried about MB Power's debt, but I do find sometimes that we oversimplify it. NB Power is a capital-intensive organization. There's always going to be debt. So I'd like to hear more around the conclusion that debt is at $5 billion. It's just a number. Debt is at $1 billion or debt is at $3 billion. It could all sound concerning depending where you are, but what exactly concerns you about this level of debt at the moment?
NB Power has a mandated debt-to-equity ratio in their act, as I believe you know, and they've never met it. They've been over that for as long as I can remember. Right? So I'll at least give that for the last 10 years. I'll at least home it into that. This probably has been more the level of time I've been paying more attention to it than probably did as a younger man. The issue is being able to pay off these assets. I guess to your point, you're right, debt is debt, but when the revenues cannot sustain, when NB Power cannot self-sustain itself, it becomes a debt to the taxpayers. Now, perhaps the average person may not differentiate, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is the ideal behind the utility is the users pay. So if I'm using the electricity, shouldn't I pay for it? Whereas my tax dollars are meant to hopefully provide the health, education services, the other things that all New Brunswickers access and utilize. And we're coming to that point where, with big future investments, instead of being able to self-sustain and pay for itself, the demand is going to fall to province as the fallback. The province is the owner of NB Power. The taxpayers are going to have to help fund this. So it means tax dollars that are now going to health, education, social services may end up having to help support NB Power because it can't self-sustain once it hits these additional debts. The revenues won't pay the bills. So who's going to pay?
Yeah, I guess the 80 to 20, I want to get to it. First of all, I just want to make one.
COVID reports that you're
Bring it to over $2 billion in the last 5 years. However, there's other debts that our names are signed to, so that's great. We need to know that, so that's good. So Mr. Chair.
Just as your time expired. Good job. Ms. Mitton, I believe the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask a few bigger picture questions. I was wondering, does this complete all of the COVID reports that your office is going to do?
I'm sorry. I need you to repeat that. I
Sure.
couldn't hear.
I was just saying, I want to ask a few sort of bigger picture questions. Does this complete all of the COVID reports that your office is going to do?
Yes, at this time, yes.
Okay. I was also wondering how many staff are working in your office at this moment?
I don't have the exact numbers. We will be releasing, it's one of our performance indicators for retention, and the amount of turnover in the office has been identified as one of our criteria that we're going to be assessing our performance on, and we have performance report coming out before the end of December up to the end of the last fiscal year.
Okay.
On average, we probably have 30 to 35 staff at any time
30 to 35, okay. And
in that range.
And
for
so-
the total office, admin, professionals, et cetera.
Okay, and one of the reasons I'm asking is because I'm wondering if you felt you had enough resources to audit the healthcare system during COVID, and to look at everything that needed to be looked at.
In doing the scoping work for our audits, we try to look at what the key areas, key matters are that, at least in our opinion, what are key, what are the high-risk areas. I have no doubt we've not covered everything everybody can think of with respect to COVID, but we made scoping decisions at the outset of our audits, and we felt we had some of the main key areas and provided some good, solid recommendations for improvements to be made going forward. However, and we're aware that certainly the government and the motion offered to provide additional funding if that was seen useful for making sure we did this. We did not request anything additional. A lot of the findings that we were seeing in the scoping, in the work that we were finding, boiled down to needs for after-action reviews, where the departments, the people on the ground could dig deeper on some of these matters and get that direct feedback from the people on the ground in their departments than value we could give in giving that same information or doing a pile of interviews, that they're capable of doing it and building it into their after-action reviews and their planning going forward. So it was about trying to come away with the key areas that we thought were of risk, of importance, and trying to add some value there in the way we approached this.
When I look at some of the things that, like what happened within the healthcare system is huge. I wonder if you considered breaking up chapters into like RHA's, public health, and then like management of the healthcare system as a whole. Because there's quite a bit, I think, to dig into on those different pieces.
certainly some of the feedback in September and from yourself today, it's obvious there's areas of concern to you and maybe to also other members here on PAC, and we are certainly here to help assist PAC in your duties and holding government accountable. If you and others believe there is additional work we should do on COVID on specific matters, we would be very open to meet with you, hear those concerns, consider them, and see if there's value we can add, consider them in future audit plans. So certainly we don't intend to do more work, but if that is the will of the committee and there's importance there and things we can be of assistance with, we would absolutely be happy to discuss it and consider whether there's value in doing more work and in what areas. What are the specifics that you're after, so that there is no confusion, and if we can bring value, let's focus on what that scope is and try to help you achieve that.
Okay, thank you for your response. I guess before I move on to some other questions, I'll ask you, and in light of your recent response, maybe that changes things, but do you think we need a public inquiry into what happened in COVID? Would that maybe capture everything that needs to be captured and maybe be able to have the scope needed to dig into things that maybe your office wasn't able to or isn't able to? So do you think there's a need for a public inquiry?
I couldn't comment whether an inquiry would help or not. That would be a decision amongst yourselves and those in government. However, those things within my control, if there's matters that I can be of assistance with, areas that are of importance and need to be looked at, I'm absolutely here to help and happy to consider those, and my door is open, and I'm available to be contacted anytime for discussion, if you'd like a discussion on those matters.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell us what were the 33 recommendations that you sampled, looking at the, I guess, Department of Health and looking at OCMO, the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health's recommendations?
So I can say that in general, it was the big decisions that affected all of the province, as I mentioned before, whether it was masking or border control and so on. Our working paper files are under protection of the Auditor General Act, don't get to be laid publicly in front of committee or the legislature. So we wouldn't go into specifics, but generally at a high level, it was the high level decisions. And certainly you're welcome to inquire further of the department about what they did or didn't have supporting evidence for that they were able to give us.
Can you explain that you're not able to tell us what 33 recommendations you looked at? Because in the report, there are a few other things that you looked at and are describing. And I think it's important for us to understand the decisions that you've identified that didn't have documented evidence and backup provided to you.
when we come before the Public Accounts Committee, we speak to the matters that are publicly disclosed in our report, and certainly the specifics on support for the recommendations, you're absolutely welcome to ask the department those matters. When it comes to the specifics of our working papers and our testing, if it's not in the report, if you were to refer to 15.2 in the Auditor General Act, working papers in respect of an audit by the Auditor General shall not be laid before the Legislative Assembly or any committee of the Legislative Assembly. So I cannot, if it isn't in the report, I can't give you the list that we sampled from our working papers. I'd be in contradiction to the Act. The department should be able to give you, though, if you ask them, we'd like to see the 35 the Auditor General tested, they should be able to provide you that and whatever evidence they had that was supporting it.
Is there a reason you didn't include it in your report? Because if you had included it, then you'd be able to talk about it?
Audit standards, sampling is a normal part of auditing standards and the auditing process, and it's just simply not common to put in a report every sample and your findings for every specific sample. We usually provide you with the results of that sampling, and that's what we have done here. So it's used in the decision-making process to come up with the recommendations. It's not that it couldn't be, but in this case, and in most cases, the sampling is not normally given in that detail in the report.
Okay. I guess there are just significant things that, or decisions that were made that I think we need to understand, you know, what happened and how they could happen better in the future. So, for example, I'm thinking about like if we go to education, looking at the province's decision not to extend the masking protections in schools through to the end of the 2022 school year, and I see the end of the audit was set to March 14th, 2022. Can you discuss the decision around the end date, and can you discuss the decision not to look specifically at that significant policy?
Yes, so when it came to the audit scope for the majority of our COVID audits, and for instance in the, well, I just happened to be looking at the JPS one, but I don't think the education one is any different as well. Just give me 1 second. Scope for education, EECD, must be back here. Yes, so if I refer you to paragraph 3.6 in the education chapter there for our audit scope, and you'll see that it's the same, I believe, for all 3 chapters here. Our periods were from March 11th of 2020, where the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak, and we took them to March 14th being the date the province lifted the emergency restrictions for the second time. And it was just to try and provide a framework and a timeline with which to look at and organize what we were looking at within the pandemic.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. McKee, over to you.
Just to continue on that last question on the time frame, it wasn't until